he could get even more time shaved off of his sentence because of this RDAP program. He could actually get a whole year if he successfully completes this program off of his sentence.
There is a good chance that Diddy could be eating dinner at his home tonight, a free man. And that's because an appeals court is now hearing the review of the trial in which Diddy was convicted of violating the Mann Act. And his defense lawyers are making two arguments that could sway these judges and make them overturn the conviction.
P. Diddy appeal hearing. It happened this morning. I just got out. Let me tell you something. You've been hearing for weeks. Diddy's release date getting moved up for good time served. Diddy's release date getting moved up for the drug program participation. Well, soon you might be hearing Diddy's release date moved up because of what's going on in this appeal.
Sean Diddy Combs, once sitting at the very top of the music world, is now locked in a serious fight to get out of federal prison. And his latest move is turning heads everywhere. His legal team is pushing a bold, unexpected strategy built around those private, adult-oriented tapes, trying to flip the whole narrative on its head. At a recent appeal hearing in New York, his attorneys stepped up and argued that these recordings shouldn't be seen as evidence of any crimes at all. Instead, they claimed the footage falls under protected amateur content covered by the First Amendment. Yeah, that's the angle they're running with. The case was put in front of 3 federal judges as his legal team, led by Alexandra Shapiro and Nicole Westmoreland, pushed hard to overturn his conviction and get him released as soon as possible. Everything centered around how those recordings and hotel nights should actually be understood, especially when it comes to the charges tied to the 56-year-old mogul. According to the defense, these events weren't random or reckless. They say they were carefully planned out, with costumes, role play, and even staged lighting involved. The claim is that everything was filmed on purpose so Combs and his partners could watch it later as private content.
They say freak-offs and hotel nights were highly choreographed sexual performances involving the use of costumes, role play, and staged lighting, which were filmed so Combs and his girlfriends could watch this amateur pornography later. Pornography production and viewing of this sort is protected by the First Amendment and thus cannot constitutionally be prosecuted.
His lawyers argued that this kind of material counts as protected expression under the Constitution, which means it shouldn't be used to support criminal charges in the first place. They even stated pornography, production, and viewing of this sort is protected by the First Amendment and thus cannot constitutionally be prosecuted, directly going at the foundation of the case. This argument takes aim straight at his conviction under the Federal Mann Act, the law that bans transporting people across state lines for illegal sexual activity, setting up a major legal showdown. Combs' legal team didn't stop there. They also pushed hard on claims that his original federal trial was handled unfairly. According to them, the presiding judge, Arun Subramanian, leaned on conduct tied to charges Combs had already beaten in court, which they say crossed a serious line. They argued that behavior linked to counts where he was found not guilty should never have played a role in deciding his sentence. Because of that, his attorneys are demanding big changes. They want a full judgment of acquittal, or at the very least, for the conviction to be thrown out and the case sent back for a new sentencing. Their goal is clear: open the door for Combs to walk free sooner rather than later. They're framing this as a major legal misstep that could shift everything if the court agrees.
So what is this appeal about? Well, I think the best way to understand it is when you look at what the prosecution was arguing and how the judge immediately cut in and asked them this question. So the prosecution was arguing that, the lower court gave a proper sentence for the charge because there were aggravating factors here. And the judge cut in immediately and said, wait a second, I just said aggravating factors. You presented a theory of the case to the jury that this guy committed coercion, that this guy was violent, that this guy was forcing women to do stuff, and the jury rejected all of that. Why shouldn't we hold you to your theory of the case? When you hear the questions that the jury was asking, when you consider the fact that this is the longest sentence ever given to a defendant in a Mann Act case with criminal history similar to Diddy's. Nobody ever got a sentence this big. You have to consider the very real possibility that the appeals court don't just cut sentences. They don't say, oh, you're out.
The case itself is packed with high-profile drama and complicated details. Combs was arrested in September 2024, facing heavy federal charges like racketeering conspiracy, trafficking involving force, fraud or coercion, and transportation tied to illegal sexual activity. When the trial wrapped in July 2025, the verdict came back mixed, which only added more fuel to the situation. He was found guilty on 2 counts related to transportation for prostitution, each carrying up to 10 years behind bars, but cleared of the more serious racketeering and trafficking charges. By October 2025, he was sentenced and later moved to a low-security federal prison in Fort Dix, New Jersey. During sentencing, Judge Subramanian made it clear this wasn't light, saying Combs would face hard time in prison, away from your family, friends, and community, while stressing that you're being sentenced for the offenses of conviction, not the crimes he was cleared of. That point was made loud and clear by the judge. Still, the court didn't ignore the bigger picture. Judge Subramanian explained that the law requires looking at the full situation, including the nature of the offenses and Combs' personal background, which leaves space for a more layered and complicated outcome. Combs' projected release date has already shifted more than once, keeping people watching closely. It was originally set much later, but most recently got moved up to April 25, 2028. That change came after he entered a residential recovery and wellness program in November 2025, a move that can seriously impact how early someone might get out.
And that's why you're getting a higher sentence based off the ranges. He did say each time, I am not giving this sentence based off acquitted charges. And Diddy's argument is, oh yeah, you're sentencing me based on coercion. You said coercion, and I was found not guilty of trafficking. The reason he's saying that is because to be found guilty of trafficking, there has to be force, fraud, or coercion. This is why Diddy's team is arguing that they believe that the judge sentenced him on acquitted conduct.
A representative for Combs said he's been fully locked in on the process, calling him an active participant who is taking rehabilitation seriously from day one. They added that he's fully engaged in his work, focused on growth, and committed to positive change, painting a picture of someone trying to turn things around while behind bars. But it hasn't all been smooth. There have been setbacks too. At one point, his release timeline was pushed back after reports claimed he broke several prison rules. Moments like that show how tough the federal system can be, no matter how powerful or well-connected someone is on the outside. Through all of this, those tapes remain at the center of the storm. By describing them as consensual, staged, and protected content instead of anything illegal, his defense is trying to tear apart the prosecution's entire argument. It's a bold First Amendment play in a high-stakes appeal, and it could influence how similar cases involving private recordings and public figures are handled in the future. Legal experts have made it clear, arguments mixing free speech with cases involving sexual conduct are tough to win, even if they've been seen before. The line between protected expression and illegal activity usually comes down to key issues like consent, coercion, and crossing state lines, and those are exactly the points Combs' team is fighting hard over right now. Their push for immediate release shows just how urgent this situation is for the defense, especially with Combs serving time away from his family and major business moves. Even with everything going on, he's kept a steady public image, with supporters pointing to his long history in music and culture as proof of his impact over the years. On the flip side, critics aren't letting up. They continue to highlight the seriousness of the allegations and stress that accountability still matters. This appeal has become another major chapter in a case that's pulled in massive attention, sparking bigger conversations about power in the entertainment world, personal boundaries, and how complicated the justice system can really get.
So what they're saying is, look, if you want to use the Mann Act to prosecute people who are moving prostitutes across state lines for commercial transactions, which again is what it's usually used for, that's one thing. But here, there's no commercial purpose. Diddy lost money. He ended up paying the prostitutes. The films were never distributed to anybody. The defense is saying it was for his pleasure and the pleasure of people who may have been participating. So they're saying, look, this is like any porn. It could be OnlyFans. It could be anything like that. And all of that is constitutionally protected.
Now, all eyes are on the 3-judge panel as they weigh these arguments carefully. There's still a real chance Combs could get out earlier than expected, depending on how the court rules. If they accept the idea that the tapes count as protected speech, it could shake things up. But if they uphold the conviction, that sends a very different message with long-term impact. For now, the music mogul remains behind bars, continuing his rehabilitation while his legal team pushes hard to bring him home. Sean "Diddy" Combs, once at the top of the industry, is still in the middle of a high-stakes battle for his freedom, and it's far from over. At a recent appeal hearing in New York, Combs' legal team stepped in with a bold argument, trying to flip the meaning of those recordings completely. Instead of treating them as evidence of crimes, his attorneys claimed they should be seen as protected amateur content under the First Amendment, turning the whole case into a fight over free speech. The hearing played out in front of 3 federal judges, with Alexandra Shapiro and Nicole Westmoreland leading the charge to overturn his conviction and push for his immediate release. Everything came down to how those tapes and hotel nights were interpreted, putting the spotlight right back on the details tied to the 56-year-old music mogul.
But what could happen here is the appeals court can say to the lower court that, hey, you know how you gave him an enhancement because he was coercive? That's not right. You can't consider any coercion, any giving people drugs, any physical violence, because all of that stuff he was acquitted of. If he wasn't acquitted of it, then he would have been found guilty of sex trafficking. But obviously the jury said, hey, the coercion, the physical violence, it's not enough to meet sex trafficking. Why is it now being used to enhance his sentence for prostitution? What I would expect, I think very soon here, a couple of weeks, you're going to get a decision, and potentially that decision is going to involve a remand for resentencing, which would then potentially involve a lighter sentence and more updates telling you that Diddy's release date has been moved up.
According to his lawyers, these weren't random situations. They described them as carefully staged performances, complete with costumes, role play, and controlled lighting. They argued the footage was recorded on purpose so Combs and his partners could watch it later as private material, not something meant to break the law. The defense leaned heavily on the Constitution, saying this kind of content falls under protected speech and shouldn't be used to build a criminal case at all. They even stated, pornography, production, and viewing of this sort is protected by the First Amendment and thus cannot constitutionally be prosecuted, making their stance crystal clear. That argument goes straight at his conviction under the Federal Mann Act, the law that bans transporting individuals across state lines for illegal sexual activity. On top of that, his team claimed the original trial wasn't handled fairly, pointing directly at Judge Arun Subramanian's decisions during sentencing. They argued the judge relied on conduct tied to charges Combs was already cleared of, saying that should never have influenced the outcome. Because of these issues, the defense is now pushing for a full acquittal, or at the very least for the conviction to be thrown out and sent back for a new sentencing, which they believe could open the door for Combs to get out sooner. The defense is pushing hard for his prompt release from custody, but the road here has been anything but simple. It's a high-profile case packed with serious claims and non-stop attention. Combs was arrested back in September 2024, facing major federal charges like racketeering conspiracy, trafficking involving force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation tied to illegal sexual activity, putting him right in the center of a legal storm.
If either of those arguments fly, if the appellate court believes that this is constitutionally protected porn, or if the appellate court believes that the sentence was out of whack, 15 months is more appropriate. Either one of those, Diddy is a free man.
By July 2025, the trial wrapped up with a mixed verdict that kept everyone talking. He was found guilty on 2 counts related to transportation for each carrying up to 10 years behind bars, but he was cleared of the more serious racketeering and trafficking charges, creating a split outcome that both sides continue to argue over. In October 2025, he was sentenced and later moved to a low-security federal prison in Fort Dix, New Jersey, where he's been serving time since. During sentencing, Judge Subramanian didn't hold back, acknowledging how serious the situation was, while also pointing out the limits of what the jury actually convicted him for. He told Combs the punishment would mean hard time in prison, away from your family, friends, and community, but made it clear with, "You're being sentenced for the offenses of conviction, not anything he was found not guilty of." Still, the judge explained that the law requires looking at the full picture, including the nature of the offenses and Combs' personal background, leaving room for a more layered decision. His release date has already shifted multiple times, keeping things unpredictable. It was once set further out, but most recently got moved up to April 25, 2028. That change came after he entered a residential recovery and wellness program in November 2025, where a representative said he's been an active participant, adding that he's fully engaged in his work, focused on growth, and committed to positive change, showing signs of effort while behind bars. Taking part in rehabilitation programs like this can actually work in someone's favor, sometimes opening the door to earlier release options, even before an appeal fully plays out. But it hasn't all been smooth for Combs, as he's also hit setbacks along the way, including a delay in his release timeline after reports claimed he broke several prison rules, showing just how strict and unpredictable the federal system can be. Those recordings continue to sit right at the center of the controversy, and his defense is working overtime to completely reframe how they're seen. Instead of anything illegal, they're calling them consensual, staged, and protected content, trying to shift the narrative away from criminal claims and toward constitutional rights. With that move, the defense is clearly aiming to break down the prosecution's entire case piece by piece. It's a bold and aggressive strategy built around the First Amendment, and in a high-stakes appeal like this, it could end up influencing how similar situations are handled when it comes to public figures and private recordings. Legal experts watching closely have pointed out that using free speech arguments in cases tied to sexual conduct isn't easy to win, but it's not unheard of either. The outcome usually comes down to key factors like consent, coercion, and whether state lines were crossed, and those are exactly the areas Combs' team is challenging head-on. Their push for immediate release shows just how serious the situation is for the defense, especially with Combs still behind bars and away from his family and business world. Even with everything happening, he's kept a steady public image, while supporters continue to highlight his long-standing impact on music and culture over the years. Critics aren't backing down at all. They keep pointing to the seriousness of the allegations and say accountability can't be ignored. This appeal has turned into another major chapter in a story that's grabbed massive public attention, while also raising bigger questions about power in the entertainment industry, personal boundaries, and how complicated the justice system can really get. As the three-judge panel reviews everything, the possibility of Combs walking free sooner than expected is still very real. It all comes down to whether the court accepts this bold argument that the tapes fall under protected speech, or if they decide to stand by the original conviction. Either way, the outcome won't just affect Combs. It could shape how similar cases are handled going forward. For now, he remains behind bars, continuing his rehabilitation efforts while his legal team pushes hard to bring him home. Sean "Diddy" Combs, once a dominant force in music, is now locked in a high-stakes battle for his freedom, using a strategy that's as unconventional as it is controversial. At that recent New York appeal hearing, his attorneys made it clear they don't see those recordings as criminal evidence at all. Instead, they framed them as protected amateur content under the First Amendment, bringing the fight straight into constitutional territory in front of 3 federal judges. Led by Alexandra Shapiro and Nicole Westmoreland, the defense is aiming to overturn the conviction and secure his immediate release. Their entire argument circles back to how those tapes and hotel nights should be understood, focusing on the details tied to the 56-year-old mogul. According to his lawyers, these events were carefully staged, involving costumes, role play, and controlled lighting, all filmed intentionally. They claim the recordings were meant for private viewing later on, describing them as consensual performances rather than anything illegal, as they continue pushing this argument in court. The defense doubled down, arguing that this kind of material falls under protected speech in the U.S. Constitution and shouldn't be used to build a criminal case at all. They made it clear with the statement, pornography, production, and viewing of this sort is protected by the First Amendment and thus cannot constitutionally be prosecuted. Drawing a hard line between expression and what they say is being wrongly labeled as crime. That argument goes straight at Combs' conviction under the Federal Mann Act, the law that bans transporting individuals across state lines for illegal sexual activity. His legal team is trying to flip that entire angle, saying the foundation of the case doesn't hold up when you look at it through a constitutional lens. They didn't stop there either. They pushed claims that the original federal trial was handled unfairly from the start. According to them, Judge Arun Subramanian relied on conduct tied to charges Combs had already beaten, which they argue should never have influenced the final sentence in any way. The team highlighted that this involved behavior connected to counts where Combs was found not guilty, making it a key issue in the appeal. Because of that, they're now demanding major action, either a full acquittal or at least for the conviction to be thrown out and sent back for a new sentencing, hoping it could lead to his release much sooner. They're aiming for prompt release from custody, but the case itself is layered and high profile, with a long timeline leading up to this moment. Combs was arrested in September 2024, facing serious federal charges like racketeering conspiracy, trafficking involving force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation tied to illegal sexual activity, putting him under intense legal pressure. When the trial wrapped in July 2025, the verdict came back mixed, keeping both sides locked in debate. He was convicted on 2 counts related to transportation for prostitution, each carrying up to 10 years, but cleared of the more serious racketeering and trafficking charges. By October 2025, he was sentenced and transferred to a low-security federal prison in Fort Dix, New Jersey, where he continues serving time while this legal battle plays out. During sentencing, Judge Subramanian made it clear he understood how serious everything was, but he also pointed out the limits of what the court could actually punish. He told Combs the sentence would mean hard time in prison, away from your family, friends, and community, while stressing, you're being sentenced for the offenses of conviction, not for anything he was cleared of. That distinction mattered, but the judge didn't ignore the bigger picture either. He explained that the law still requires the court to look at the overall situation, including the nature of the offenses and Combs' personal background, leaving space for a more detailed and balanced outcome. Since then, Combs' projected release date has shifted more than once, keeping things uncertain. It was originally set further out, but most recently got moved up to April 25, 2028, a change that caught attention as his situation continues to evolve. That adjustment came after he entered a residential recovery and wellness program in November 2025, which can play a big role in early release eligibility. A representative said he's been an active participant, adding that he's fully engaged in his work, focused on growth, and committed to positive change, showing effort behind the scenes. Still, it hasn't been a perfect run. There have been setbacks along the way. Before this latest appeal, his timeline was pushed back after reports claimed he violated multiple prison rules, highlighting just how strict and unforgiving the federal system can be, no matter who you are. Through it all, those tapes remain one of the most controversial pieces of the entire case. By framing them as consensual, staged, and constitutionally protected content instead of anything criminal, Combs' defense is trying to break down the prosecution's argument at its core, keeping this legal battle intense and far from settled. This strategy stands out as a bold and aggressive use of First Amendment rights in a high-stakes criminal appeal, and it's got people watching closely. If it works, it could set the tone for how similar situations involving public figures and private recordings are handled in the future, making this case bigger than just one person. Legal experts have pointed out that using free speech arguments in cases tied to sexual conduct isn't easy to win, but it's definitely not unheard of either. The outcome often comes down to key factors like consent, coercion, and crossing state lines. And those are exactly the pressure points Combs' team is challenging right now. Their push for immediate release shows just how urgent things are on the defense side, especially with Combs still behind bars and away from his family and business empire. Even through all of this, he's kept a public image of resilience, while supporters continue to highlight his long-standing impact on music and culture. At the same time, critics aren't letting up. They continue to stress the seriousness of the allegations and the importance of accountability. This appeal has become another intense chapter in a story that's pulled in massive attention, raising deeper questions about power, personal boundaries, and how the justice system handles complex cases like this. Now, all eyes are on the 3-judge panel as they decide what happens next. The possibility of Combs walking free sooner than expected is still on the table, and whether the court accepts this free speech argument or upholds the conviction could have major ripple effects far beyond this case. For now, the music mogul remains behind bars, continuing his rehabilitation while his legal team fights to bring him home. And this story is far from over. If you've been following this case, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one situation everyone's going to be talking about.